So again, Kant sort of was harking back to Aristotle's understanding of form and purpose as internal to organisms and nature, in contrast to the Platonic and Darwinian view of purposes as imposed from outside. And of course the difference again, Plato thought that the imposition was from a transcendent creator. Darwin thought it was from a pre-given material world or environment. Now, the thing is, though, that Kant, by recognizing that organisms could not be understood in a mechanical fashion, only established this as a regulative principle. So, in other words, it's very similar to what mechanistic biologists call the principle of teleonomy, that the purposes that seem to come out in our language and our description of the behavior of organisms is really just that, a product of our language, not a product of anything intrinsic to the organism. So because Kant had this dualism between the phenomenal and noumenal world, or between the human mind's ability to know and reality itself, he wouldn't establish self-organization or teleology as truly constitutive or intrinsic to the organism, independent of the human mind. Um, so there's this difference between a regulative principle for Kant, which again is that the human mind cannot understand the self-organizing circular causality present in living beings in terms of mechanical causation, and a constitutive principle, which is that teleology is an intrinsic property of nature itself, independent of human judgment. And the reason Kant was unwilling to make this understanding of organisms as intrinsically different from machines um, was that he thought it would require attributing to the Newtonian conception of matter um, some property of life. So instead of Newton's conception of matter as just this inert, purposeless stuff with forces imposed on it, um, it would have to be conceived of as somehow, if not living, then at least potentially living, having some internal propensity to organize. And this was called hylozoism, and Kant thought it was absurd because he was so heavily influenced by the success at the time of Newtonian classical mechanics. So, Kant did say, however, just by weight of the regulative principle of judgment alone, that the human mind cannot understand organisms mechanistically. Kant was convinced that there would never be what he called a Newton of the grass blade. In other words, someone who would come along and establish some mathematical laws which would allow us to understand and predict the evolution of the biosphere. However, in 1859, when Darwin published *The Origin of Species*, many people thought that Kant was wrong. That here, in the figure of Darwin, we have a Newton of the grass blade. But this is a misconception for the following reason, as Evan Thompson writes in his book *Mind and Life*. Quote, Kant's concern was the definite organization of living beings, but the Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection does not provide any account of organization at the level of biological individuals. On the contrary, the theory must presuppose biologically organized individuals that reproduce. So, in other words, Darwin's is a theory of only the diversity of species, not the origin of life itself, contrary to the title of his book, The Origin of Species. We would have to commit what Whitehead calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness if we were to accept Darwin's theory as an explanation of life, because we would have to mistake the abstraction species and an explanation for how this abstraction diversifies for the concrete reality of individual organisms, which Darwin said nothing about other than the last sentence of his book, where he said that the Creator breathed life into a few or a single form at the beginning, and then they diversified in terms of natural selection after that. So it's a bit of a misconception that Darwin is the Newton of the grass blade. He certainly provided a a sound law which helps us understand how some of the diversity arises in nature, but it is in no way a complete explanation for the emergence of life from apparently um, completely inert matter. Now, this principle of self-organization, which was developed in the work of Kant, was elaborated in the 70s by Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana as the theory of autopoiesis. So, at the beginning of their work, Maturana and Varela were still heavily influenced by mechanistic ways of thinking, and so they called autopoietic organisms machines and said that there was no purpose intrinsic to them. So, in that sense, they were carrying on this sense of self-organization as a regulative principle rather than as constitutive of organisms themselves. However, later in his life, Varela began to change his understanding of teleology and began to recognize that actually autopoiesis allows us to understand purpose as intrinsic to organisms themselves, independent of our human judgment of them. To give you a better sense for what autopoiesis means in the later work of Varela, I'll read you a quote. He says, quote, "An autopoietic system, which is the minimal living organization, is one that continuously produces the components that specify it, while at the same time realizing it, the system, as a concrete unity in space and time, which makes the network of production of components possible." So this concrete unity that Varela is here talking about is akin to the formal cause of an organism, arising due to the circular dynamics of self-organization. So we might also call this unity, this concrete unity, an identity, which immediately implies that the being in question is experiential, that it has an interior, and that it acts purposefully. So formal and final causes are thereby made an intrinsic property of organisms themselves, or at least so it seems. But this is where Whitehead's metaphysics become important, I think, because there's really three types of or levels of autopoiesis. There's autopoiesis at the cellular level, which is the minimal organization of life, as Varela just said. Then there's the autopoiesis of multicellular organisms, which is almost the same process of organization. You know, our bodies are made of various organs which participate in the creation and production of one another, and a boundary which defines them as a unity. But then there's also autopoiesis at a cognitive level, whereby our nervous system self-produces a domain of interaction and brings forth a world. The metaphor that Varela uses to understand this process of what he calls enactivism is that we gain knowledge of the world by laying down a path and walking. So as we navigate the world, we come to know it through our activity, and knowledge is thereby not something about an objective world existing independent of our activity, but rather emerges through our interaction with the world. And so the question then becomes, how do we justify generalizing our own phenomenological experience of gaining knowledge of the world by laying down a path and walking to other organisms in our environment? And Varela was heavily influenced by the phenomenological thinkers like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, who recognized that teleology is somehow, in our own experience as human beings, more concrete than mechanical causality, which is an abstraction that we project. So it's reversing the picture of the mechanistic biologist who think that it's teleology which we must project on nature, and instead seeing the mechanistic picture of nature as a projection which we abstract due to our ability to use language in such an efficient manner from our concrete experience as purposeful beings. So the question becomes, how do we generalize this to other organisms, which I'll get to in part 3.